As I said before, my name is Imaad Ahmed. I'm the Marketing Director at Warc. And I'm going to run you through some of the results that came from a report that we brought out earlier this year. So we're going to look at 4 trends. Firstly, how the influence of strategy teams is changing. We're going to look at how the competitor set is changing as well for planners and strategists. We'll ask the question whether planning is becoming too executional, and we'll end by looking at some of the opportunities and threats that our survey of planners saw in the industry over the next 12 months. A bit about us, and Adrian may have covered some of this already, but we're an advertising, marketing and media intelligence service, so we host over 70,000 pieces of best practice, trends, insights and so on. And our clients tap into us to find out what's worked, how it's worked, and the evidence behind that all. So they can put that into their presentations and make their ideas more compelling for their clients, and so on. And we see our mission, and this is kind of in the final stages of being rolled out, but we see our mission as being to save the world from ineffective marketing. So, the Future Strategy Report. So what we do every year is we survey a group of planners, so about 550 or so planners, that we got their opinions. And we wanted to know what their thoughts were on the current and future state of the industry. But as well as running the analysis of all of that, we also had essays from some of those experts as well, and you'll hear from Ben, who is one of the contributors to the report, in a moment. And the first trend was around how strategy teams are growing in influence, but also growing in terms of size as well. Now we saw that when we asked our planners about how they felt their influence was changing within their own agencies, but also within their clients as well, that over 50% in both cases felt that influence was moving in the right direction. So they're getting more influence internally and more influence externally. And that's actually a higher percentage than we found last year. So it's moving in the right direction. It's quite an optimistic view of how things are changing. When we asked them about how their teams were changing in size as well, we found that 56% of them expect their teams to grow in the next 12 months. And again, it's an optimistic view, because when we looked at how they felt their teams had changed in shape and size over the previous 12 months, actually only 39% of them had said that their teams had grown, 20% had said that their teams had shrunk, but they're expecting growth in the next 12 months. So again, quite an optimistic view of the influence of strategy teams around agencies, but also how that influence can play out with clients too. However, for all that optimism, there was some pessimism as well. And this is quite a cool quote from a planner in Sweden. And it's really the last bit that I want to focus on, about how planners are feeling the squeeze on the stress and fear of digital. So quite a common thought amongst the survey respondents was that clients were becoming more and more distracted by the shiny, bright new objects, so new tech platforms, for example, and that was distracting them from the bigger picture ideas that planners want to be playing in. And I suppose another byproduct of that is that as they're moving away, actually that relationship between the agency and the client is potentially weakening, because there's a lack of trust as clients are spreading the agency planners' time so thinly across these new platforms. And that was, again, quite a common thought that came out of the survey. The next trend that we saw was around the competitor set and how that's changing for agency planners. And there are 2 key areas for this. There's the growth of in-house teams amongst clients, but also the growth of management consultancies. And anyone who's been to like Cannes in the last few years would have seen just how much greater presence the big consultancies are having there and taking over some of that space from agencies. And that's probably quite representative of where the industry may shift in time. I suppose we'll have to wait and see. But against all that, there was this note of caution that this strategy director from the US pointed out. And that is that in-house teams, although they're the biggest competition, they lack the skills and experience to deliver the same quality. So the output is potentially inferior. And when we looked at what some of the other sentiment was from the planners, that came from a variety of different sources and different reasons. So for example, some of our planner respondents were saying that it's just sort of the level of politics that an in-house strategist has to play with that an external viewpoint may not necessarily have to deal with. The increase of politics therefore affecting the actual quality of that output. But also just how impartial and objective an external view can be, and losing out on the quality of insight that comes from having that kind of external view is another area of danger, I suppose, for strategists, and a danger for the end product. Looking at consultancies, we found that 56% thought that management consultancies would be a threat to the planning function. But I think the interesting thing here, and we'll look at a later slide where it shows that planners are very much aware of management consultancies as a threat. It's in so much of the trade press. But when we looked at what was the biggest threat over the next 12 months, actually management consultancies didn't factor that highly. So it's a known threat, but not necessarily the biggest threat that's keeping planners awake. We also looked at how planning is potentially moving towards a more executional slant, so moving downstream and away from upstream, and how much of that is driven by clients and the demands that clients are putting on their agencies and where they're asking them to focus. And one of our respondents came up with this quote, which is quite interesting, around how we're moving towards kind of fast and cheap at the expense of smart, and how that doesn't bode well for the state of strategy. And what's happening here is, I suppose it calls into question what the current role of the planner actually is, whether the viewpoint of a planner themselves is the same as how a client sees the role of the planner. And there were mixed thoughts on that from our survey respondents, where they often thought that, as I mentioned before, that clients are moving some planning thought and some of the planning smarts away from the upstream solving of big business problems towards the more executional and downstream campaign elements. And again, there's a tension there between where planners want to be playing on these big upstream ideas versus where the reality is of clients moving them towards more executional elements. And again, there are various reasons for that. What came out in the survey was that some planners were saying that there's a heightened focus by clients on executional elements. They also mentioned that budgets were being cut, and we'll see in a moment that has kind of other offshoots to that. But also, quite a few of the planners in the survey were saying that they're just getting less and less access to client data, which means they can't show off their smarts in the same way as they might have been able to do in the past. And again, this throws up tensions between where the planner wants to be and where the client sees them being, and how actually they can move towards a safer middle ground, a more effective middle ground as well. Now, I mentioned about the lower budgets. That may be one of the reasons for the quote that you saw beforehand. And as budgets are dropping, one of the things that planners also felt was falling off was the amount of training available to strategists and to planners. And as that's happening, craft skills are under threat as well, which of course has massive impact on not only the quality of the end product from agencies, but also how much clients can trust planners that they're supposedly giving budget towards and putting lots of trust in, or should be putting lots of trust in terms of how effective that output can be at the end. Another area related to planning, related to training, sorry, is that lots of planners, so 75%, felt that they needed to get away from their desks more and more. So actually what's happening is this, this widespread frustration, clients moving them towards executional elements, is meaning that planners are stuck really at their desks rather than experiencing the real world. And there's actually, there's a really cool essay from Rob Campbell in the report, so ex-CSO from Deutsche, from Weiden, who talks about how he sent 3 of his planners on a backpacking trek across America and wanted them to experience the most, the most diverse kind of and different types of cities, different types of viewpoints, shrinking population cities or towns versus ones where they're quite buoyant and increasing in population. Because he wanted them to get a broader view of actually how nuanced consumers can be in such a broad landscape, rather than, as he mentions in his essay, being stuck at their desk and having a very tunnel-visioned view of what the consumer outlook would be. So, there are, obviously it's easier said than done, following, an example of someone like Rob and what he did with his team. But there are kind of ways out there, and there are CSOs out there who are very mindful of this fact. And the final trend that I will look at is opportunities and threats. And what's interesting here is that the opportunities actually play kind of almost counter opposites to the threats that I'll show you in a moment. So when we asked our audience about, what do you see as the biggest opportunity, planners and strategists at your company, the things that came out on top were drawing insight from client data and also working on upstream business problems. So I've already mentioned around the frustration, I suppose, of being forced to work on downstream execution as opposed to upstream bigger picture thinking. But also it's interesting to see kind of third in line about the focus by clients on effectiveness and how planners are very mindful of how that's another way of increasing the trust amongst clients in the planning functions to then move them back away from the executional towards this bigger picture thinking. And therefore, I suppose, feeding on, giving them greater access to the data to be able to come up with these insights and these big picture ideas. And the reason I said it's an interesting contrast between the opportunities and threats is because they mirror over quite nicely. When we looked at what our planners thought were the biggest obstacles affecting their ability to do their jobs, actually the thing that ranked the highest was that they were spending too much time on tactical campaign elements. So that downstream that they voiced a frustration of elsewhere in the report. The next point was around lack of access to data, which, as we saw a moment ago, they saw as the biggest opportunity, but it's an opportunity that at the moment is in part closed off to them because they're not getting the necessary access. And the other thing that I wanted to point out here, and I mentioned it a bit earlier, is just how lowly ranked management consultancies are when planners talked about the obstacles over the next 12 months. So we saw earlier that 56% saw them as a threat, but actually when we look at threats over the next 12 months, they don't rank in the top 5, so there are bigger things at play out there for agency strategists and planners to be worrying about. And that led really to this interesting quote from a CSO in New Zealand who talked about how planners can move from this reputation, if you like, amongst some clients of downstream thinking to more upstream and build that trust. And how the way to do that was to upskill in all areas of the business, so providing a broader business perspective as opposed to the siloed marketing perspective that's been at play in some planning teams in the past. And again, that was a huge area of opportunity that was highlighted here. So to recap quickly, so we saw that influence was growing, both in terms of how much influence planners felt there was within their own agencies, but also amongst clients, and that their team sizes were growing, which was a very optimistic view. We saw that as influence is growing, so is the competitor set. So not only from management consultancies, which is, as we've just seen, a threat that is out there, but not necessarily the biggest threat, but also from in-house teams and the various problems that can create, not only for agencies in terms of obviously lost billings, but in terms of inferior output as a potential offshoot, and the reputational risk that conveys. We saw that a widespread frustration was this feeling that planners are being moved away from big picture strategy to more executional elements. So clients looking at new tech platforms and asking their planners and strategists at their agencies to focus their time on those areas, which is showing in the viewpoints of our audience who took the survey, not only a lack of trust, but also misapplying the skills of the planners where they can really add value to a business and solve business problems. And finally, we looked at the flip side of the opportunities and threats. So data is both a huge opportunity if planners can get more access to the best kind of data from their clients. On the flip side, it's also a threat because there's a worry that actually clients aren't giving them that access at the moment, and that may continue over the next 12 months. And the other mirrored effect, I suppose, is on upstream versus downstream in terms of the opportunity of upstream big picture thinking as a way of agencies to build up value amongst clients, but also the downstream reality that some planners are feeling in the survey that their skills are being misappropriated and actually they're not being allowed to work on upstream ideas enough to show true value for clients. Now, if you do subscribe to Warc, go onto the site, you'll have access to the report in full. If you're not a Warc client, you can get a sample at that link over there. And if you want to know more about Warc and what we do and how we can help, then get in touch with one of our team at the demo link, and we'll see if it's right for you. Thank you.